In our last video, we looked at the development of sociology as it began in Europe. Today, we're going to be looking at sociology in America. Before we get to sociology in America, I would like us to look back at our notes from last lecture and answer this question. How did the various pioneers of sociology contribute to the development of sociological theory? As we look at sociology in America, I would like us to answer this question. What were the contributions of early American sociologists? So as we go through each sociologist, be asking yourself this question and answering it. What was their contribution to the field of sociology? Okay, so although the early development of sociology occurred in Europe, the greatest development of sociology has taken place inside the United States. Because sociology has become a science largely through the efforts of American sociologists, it is not surprising that many of the most influential sociologists worked in the U.S. The global influence of American sociologists is reflected in the fact that sociologists throughout the world use sociological writings that are in English. In 1892, the first department of sociology was established at the University of Chicago. From its founding until World War II, the sociology department at the University of Chicago stood at the forefront of American sociology. After World War II, sociology departments at Eastern universities such as Harvard and Columbia, Midwestern universities such as Wisconsin and Michigan, and even Western universities such as Stanford and the University of California at Berkeley emerged as leaders in sociology as well. Some early contributors to American sociology, including Jane Addams and Booker T. Washington, directed much of their efforts towards solving society's problems through social activism. Challenging racism and social discrimination became the life's work of African American sociologists such as Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And we'll be talking about them today. Okay, the first American sociologist we are going to cover is Jane Addams. Jane Addams was the best known of the early female social reformers in the United States. She spent her life working on the social problems created by the imbalance of power among social classes. When she was a child, Addams saw many examples of government corruption and business practices that harmed workers. She never forgot their suffering. While on one of her European trips, she saw the work being done to help the poor in London. With this example of social action, Addams began her life's work, seeking social justice. Addams co-founded Hull House in Chicago. Here, people who needed refuge, like immigrants, the sick, the poor, and the aged, could find help. Addams focused on the problems caused by the imbalance of power among the social classes. She invited sociologists from the University of Chicago to Hull House to witness firsthand the effects of industrialism on the lower classes. In addition to her work with the lower class, Addams was active in the women's suffrage and peace movements. As a result of her tireless work for social reform, Addams was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, and she was the first sociologist to receive this honor. The irony with Addams is that she suffered from a sort of class discrimination, and that is what she studied. See, she wasn't considered a sociologist because she did not work at a university. Instead, she was considered a social reformer, one, because she didn't work in a university, and also because she was a woman and worked with the poor. And a social reformer was a less prestigious career than a sociologist. W.E.B. Du Bois is an activist that you might remember from history. He was an African American educator and social activist, and he was the first African American to receive a doctoral degree from Harvard University. And he taught at a number of predominantly African American universities during his career. Du Bois learned firsthand about racial discrimination and segregation when he attended Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee as an undergraduate student. Partly from this experience and from teaching in rural all African American schools around Nashville, Du Bois decided to attack the assumption that African Americans were an inferior race. Du Bois analyzed the sophisticated social structure of African American communities, first in Philadelphia and then later in other places as well. Du Bois' concern for his race did not stop at the borders of the United States. He was also active in the Pan-African movement, which was concerned with the rights of all African descendants, no matter where they lived. While documenting his experience and contributions of African people throughout the world, Du Bois died in the African country of Ghana at the age of 95. He also founded the NAACP. Booker T. Washington is another gentleman you might have heard of before. Du Bois' demands for African American civil rights and racial equality put him at odds with the other voice of the African American community, which was Booker T. Washington. Washington had begun his life in slavery. After emancipation, he became an educator, founding the Tuskegee Institute in 1881. And Washington held different assumptions than Du Bois about the best course of action for African Americans. He worked under the assumption that African Americans should accept segregation in return for promises of economic gains. Robert Ezra Park worked as an aide to Booker T. Washington at the Tuskegee Institute from 1905 to 1914. After he left Tuskegee, Park taught at the University of Chicago, where he specialized in race relations and human ecology, the study of the relationship among individuals, social groups, and their social environments. Park was interested in how populations grow and change. He wanted to know how groups were organized in different ways to enable them to compete and cooperate. Park, who began his career as a journalist, was also interested in the social function of newspapers as a record of public events. He believed that a sociologist was a kind of super reporter who chronicled the long-term trends in society. He is credited with moving American sociology toward a more objective methodology. George Herbert Mead, he also taught at the University of Chicago, and Mead explored how our sense of self develops. According to Mead, our sense of self develops as we interact with our world. Language, symbols, and communication are at the heart of the process, and Mead's work laid the foundation for the theoretical perspective of symbolic interactionism, which we'll talk about later. Julian Zamora, he became known as the first Mexican-American to earn a doctorate in sociology when he graduated from Washington University in St. Louis in 1953. He went on to conduct pioneering work in Mexican-American studies. Zamora's focus was on civil rights and discrimination, poverty, public health, and the movement of people among the Mexican-American border. While at Notre Dame University, he founded the Mexican-American Graduate Studies program and headed the Mexican Border Studies Project. So think about this. How did early American sociologists change the nature of sociology? Turn to the person next to you and talk about that for a moment, and then we'll talk about it as a class and wrap up.